Everybody, and welcome to the Ed Collab Gathering Spring 2024 gathering. It's so great to have you here, and I'm excited to be here as well. And I so appreciate you choosing to spend some time with me to talk about how to advocate for comics and graphic novels in schools and classrooms. My name is Shawna Coppola, and before we begin, just a couple of logistics. One is I'm working from home, and so that means that I may have some visitors popping in, maybe a daughter or two. I also have a very strong-willed dog who is obsessed with me. So unfortunately, I might have to also um, attend to her really quickly. But what I'll try to do is pause the recording so that it doesn't interrupt your day and your schedule. And then the last thing is it's really important for me to be upfront. I do have ADHD and I am on autistic spectrum. And so oftentimes when I'm presenting, I tend to lose my words. And I just want folks to know that that's not because I'm unprepared or that I don't care about the work that I'm doing. It's just something that happens in my brain. And prior to my late 40s, before I was diagnosed, I just really tried to compensate and record 1,000 times. And now what I do is I'm just trying to be really transparent about that. And I know that folks will understand and have some grace for that. So thank you in advance for that. All right. I am so excited. This is one of my very favorite topics to present about. And so we will start with the official title of this presentation, but that's not real reading, advocating for the use of comics and graphic novels with readers of any age. So again, thank you for being with me today. I know this is a topic that is very timely. And so let's get started. So again, welcome. My name is Shawna Coppola. I have been in public education for over 25 years now. I've spent most of my time working, although I've worked with learners of literally almost all ages. I think my oldest student, when I was teaching a graduate class, was in her late 70s. And I think of her often. Pat, we love you. She's since passed, and I miss her very much. But I think of her all the time when I talk about the age range of students that I've worked with. I've also worked with infants as a children's librarian in my local town. And I currently, most of my work is done either consulting in K-12 schools, or I also teach writing to undergraduates at a local community college. So love, love, love being able to have all those different experiences. I am also the author of several books for teachers about literacy. My latest book is called Literacy for All, a framework for anti-oppressive teaching. Just came out in December and super excited about it. It is the book I've always wanted to write. And I do talk about comics and graphic novels and other multimodal texts in that book. But my last book, Writing Redefined, Broadening Our Ideas of What It Means to Compose, is chock full of information and guidance about using multimodal texts like comics and graphic novels in the classroom. I also am an Educator collaborative fellow. I have been so for several years now. I'm very lucky to be a part of this group of really bright thinkers and really compassionate individuals. And for those of you who want to learn more about how to teach students how to write and read comics and graphic novels, I have a mini workshop at grassrootsworkshop.com all about that. So definitely check that out if you're interested. You can see a preview of that to determine if that's something that you want to continue with or not. Since today really truly is about advocating for them. So personally, on a personal level, I have always loved multimodal text. I have loved all forms. So I've obviously been really interested in comics and compilations of comics. There were no graphic novels that were around for me when I was young. I shouldn't say that. There were there were very few, and it really wasn't a thing. But as you can see, I have a wide range of interests, some of which might be questionable when it comes to comics and graphic novels. And I also have always loved magazines, catalogs, anything that is multimodal and in print. I have had an obsession with at one time or another. So these are just some of my favorites growing up. So I've been at this work in some sense for quite a long time. Our agenda for today, I'm going to share with you some history behind comics and graphic novels. And the reason for that, besides my obsession with figuring out how we got to where we are today, is that it's so important to understand I guess where we've gotten to today. It's so pertinent to our conversation about why we need to advocate for these kinds of texts in schools and classrooms, and just in general. So I'm going to share a very tiny part of that history. We're going to talk about some common misconceptions, many of which you probably have heard yourself around comics and graphic novels. I'm going to share with you what some of the research says around this. And then we're going to talk about practical ways to advocate and what kind of language we can use to advocate for their use in schools and classrooms. But first, it's so important for us to have some common language because a lot of folks are confused about what makes a comic versus, say, a graphic novel. And that is because it is confusing. I do love this comic by Jarrett Lerner, and he writes comic novels are not a genre, they are a format. That is probably one of the biggest misconceptions around what they are that I've heard. And, a lot of folks think that comics are genres where, in fact, they are a form. They're an organization, a way of organizing text. And so I really love this comic. However, it is still really hard to define what a comic is. And so here I have a comic is sequential art, but there's an asterisk there because we see sequential art or sequential visual language in things like photo essays and in videos and so on and so forth. So some people say, well, is it because a comic is actually sequential art and text that work together? Yes. However, that also sort of erases the presence of wordless comics and graphic novels. And so it's really confusing. For all intents and purposes, I'm going to call comics, when I say comics today, that's going to be a big umbrella for a lot of different things. So we can think in terms of comic strips, like the classic Nancy or the classic Peanut strip, where we have really clear sequential art and sequential visual and alphabetic text together. But we can also think of it in terms of graphic novels. And all graphic novels are under that big umbrella of comics. So graphic novels like memoirs, like They Called Us Enemy, or humorous graphic novels like Captain Underpants, those are all under that big umbrella of comics in general that I'm going to be using today. So I have done an inquiry with students around what makes a comic and what makes a graphic novel and how are they different. And it's been so fascinating. It's such a great inquiry to do because in creating or in developing this inquiry, you talk a lot about the different features of these forms of text, but you don't really come to a conclusion. And that can be frustrating for some, but for me, I just love it because it's not really about an answer. It's about talking and discussing and analyzing and, doing all that stuff that leads to those discussions. So people will ask, is something like Fly Guy a comic or a graphic novel? Well, for me, it doesn't fall under that category, and there's a couple reasons where I can articulate why that is, but that doesn't mean that I'm right. And so that's kind of a question mark. Things, texts like Fly Guy or Diary of a Wimpy Kid or those kinds of texts, they have a lot of graphic or visual text and alphabetic text. But for me, I think the presence of some sort of paneling or organization of these themes in some way is what makes a comic and graphic novel versus just a text that has a lot of visual elements to it. But that's just me. Um, I really do, though, appreciate this uh, text. This has been adapted from Terry Thompson's work, and I really appreciate what he did by calling that overarching medium graphica. So that's what he calls that overarching umbrella of text. And underneath that are different formats like a comic strip, a comic book, a graphic novel, manga. But what I think is really good about or interesting and useful about this is that picture books also fall under this big umbrella. And then he breaks it down further into different genres that each of these formats has. So we obviously have fiction and nonfiction kinds of graphica, but then when you break it down further, I would say the most common genres of comic and graphic novels fall under that fantasy, realistic fiction, superhero fiction, dystopian, humorous, that sort of thing. And then for nonfiction, we have things like memoir, which is a huge part of the comic and graphic novel industry in particular. We also have historical graphic novels. We have informational graphic novels, and so on and so forth. Actually, one of my favorite genres of graphic novel that's not listed here is horror. I love horror graphic novels too. Okay, let's get into a little bit of history around comics. So, one of the things that I have on my handout for folks who are attending the session is there's a great series of YouTube videos called The Comic Book Ages Explained. And this is really helpful for understanding sort of the history of comics in America. They started in US newspapers. That's where we first started seeing comics. And they were really used as social commentary. So when you look back at some of those comics around the late 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, most of that is satire slash social commentary. And that was the case for Japanese manga as well in many cases around that time, although manga can be traced even way back to the 15th century. So that's a whole other incredibly deep and rich history. Um, and then around, again, the turn of the 20th century, a lot of these comic strips began to be compiled into books. So you would have a comic book that was just a compilation of a lot of these comic strips. Nothing really new. It was just kind of remixed into a book form. Um, and so that was around what we call the platinum age of comics. But the golden age is where a lot of, I think, most of you and many others who don't necessarily have a lot of that history think of when they think of comics. And that was really the superhero age. It was, the 40s and the 50s where comics just truly exploded. And what was really interesting, and what I think is especially interesting about the history of comics, is that um, originally, comics were really geared toward a readership of adults, specifically adult men. And then during this golden age, when we first see Superman and Captain America and Wonder Woman, that's when readership really shifted quite significantly to children. It wasn't that grown people were not reading them, but it also kind of brought a lot of children started reading them. And that is when the Comic Code Authority was created. Because what happened was not only were there humorous comics superhero comics and so on, there were also a lot of horror comics and a lot of crime comics at the time. And of course, this was a real problem for a lot of people who were nervous about the appropriateness of these comics and the readership that was beginning to include so many children. And so around 1954, the Comic Code Authority was established. And this um, was actually established to ensure that comics remained, quote unquote, sanitary for younger readers. This authority effectively banned all horror comics and crime comics, and so they became much more of an underground genre of comic at the time. And before we move too further, a lot of what you're going to see if you start exploring the history of comics in America in particular, you're going to see a lot that is white centered, as so much of our history is. So I want to give a really big and important shout out to this wonderful book called Desegregating Comics, which is a compilation of scholarly articles and essays that talks about um, the golden age of American comics and offers some really compelling counter narratives that center the experience of African Americans in the comic book age, the golden age, the industry, the creation, and also the readership. Because one of the things that maybe people don't know, I certainly didn't when I first started diving into the history of comics, again, because it centers so much on white readership and white creators, was that the vast majority of African American children during the golden age of comics read comics. It was one of the authors of one of the articles in this book says that comics reading was normative among Black youth, and that each stage in the process of creating, distributing, and purchasing comics was impacted to some degree by the laws and customs of racial segregation, which I don't think is really surprising to anybody who knows a lot of the history of our country, or even a little bit. But it's just a wonderful text, and I would highly recommend people dive into it because there's so much to learn that is not often part of the story that you see in mainstream histories, especially on YouTube and that sort of thing. So I want to make sure that people are aware of that. Okay, so we have this Comic Code Authority. Now, how did that come about? This is a really fun story, so I like to tell it. Some of you may or may not be aware of Dr. Frederick Wertham. Now, he was a German American psychiatrist, and one of the things that's important to know about him is that he worked with a lot of children who he called juvenile delinquents. So he worked at the psychiatric hospital in Harlem. And one of the things that he noticed that he found significant was that a lot of these so called delinquents read comics. And so he very unscientifically determined that comics were responsible for the rise in juvenile delinquency. His famous book, Seduction of the Innocent, goes into all of this. But he also wrote several long form pieces for women's magazines. And one of them was called Horror in the Nursery. And it talked about the direct correlation of comics and violent behavior in children. And if you have a chance to look that up, it's very fun to read. um, so, as much as he had some really important things to say in terms of pointing out the problematic elements of many comics in terms of the racism, the misogyny, the violence that certainly was a part of comics at the time, especially those crime and horror comics, but also in the superhero comics as well. He also would say things like that comics promote homosexual fantasies, quote unquote. He talked a lot about Batman and Robin and how terrible that was for Americans and American children, which obviously is just ridiculous. But he had such a big influence on, for whatever reason, people at the time that he really played into this whole idea that we have to sanitize comics in some way because of the big readership He also claimed that comics caused reading disorders. And so there's just so much that, he sort of observed in his professional life that he then made these giant claims about, none of which were actually scientifically valid claims. Um, and one of my favorite quotes from him is about Wonder Woman. He says, "For boys, Wonder Woman is a frightening image. For girls, she is a morbid ideal." And this was the image of Wonder Woman at the time. This is who he was talking about. And so I just find that really actually kind of humorous. And so I like to share that. Um, so, there was this big, like I said, there was this need to sort of quote unquote sanitize comics and make them not objectionable and to save our children's youth. And that's really pertinent information because it's directly correlated to some of what we're seeing today, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, just to pivot a little bit, like I said, manga goes back to at least the 15th century, but it really became popularized and turned into sort of the format that is echoed today in the 1950s. Graphic novels, on the other hand, really didn't become a thing until, well, the first graphic novel is this first image you see here by Will Eisner called The Contact with God and Other Tenement Stories. And it, it was really popularized in the 1970s because of the title of this book and or that subtitle of the book, graphic novel. And one of the reasons why Will Eisner decided to have this subtitle with this term graphic novel is he really wanted to re-broaden the audience, which had become so focused on youth, to adults. And so his work, he wanted it to be, this is an adult thing. So he incorporated the term novel in his subtitle. And then later on, after this time, we had books like Persepolis and Mouse come along. The Bone series came along, and that really started another explosion in terms of graphic novels. On the scene. And I remember that when I first started teaching. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that a lot of the misconceptions and concerns around comics in America is echoed in Japan around manga. But it's worth noting that manga is very much read by so many people of Japanese origin. And despite all of these concerns, Japan continues to have one of the highest literacy rates in the world. So I think that's really compelling and a really important piece of this advocating for this kind of graphic form that is so popular, especially among youth in our country. So, just to talk about some parallels between then and now, again, there was a surge in popularity around the, 90s and early 2000s. And then there's been another huge surge in popularity, not just with children, but with adults around graphic novels in particular now. Um, and with that comes this public backlash. So back to the golden age, many of you might remember hearing about all of these comic book burnings and, the Boy Scouts got involved. There's just some examples here on your screen. They were held across the country. And, people would talk a lot about some of those problematic elements that they saw. And it's just really interesting to me how that's such a parallel to what we are hearing now around how certain people are concerned with the so-called problematic elements of comics now. Um, so if we just think about some of the things that have happened recently, we have police officers searching libraries and classrooms for graphic novels. We have, calls for bans on so many comics and graphic novels, particularly in right-wing and conservative circles. Of course, the conservative right-wing hate group Moms for Liberty, they have called police on librarians. over certain graphic novels that are geared toward young adults. I believe I just read recently there is even I think it's in Missouri, but don't quote me on this. Something about a bill going forward wanting to uh, ensure that librarians are or kind of labeled under the laws as pedophiles if they are shown to, have these books in their library and so on. It's just ridiculous stuff. But again, don't quote me on this date. But we can see that if we look at that golden age of comics and the hysteria, I mean, there were congressional hearings on the state of comics and youth at the time. It really was a hysteria that is very much like the kind of hysteria that we see today. And so that's why I think this history is so important to know, because we can point to that and talk about some of those parallels. And is that something we want to go back to? I mean, obviously, I say no. There are a lot of reasons why we don't want to. First among them is who is driving the hysteria. So that's sort of some of the advocacy work that we want to be doing. Let's just take a quick breather, and I'd like to just take a moment to maybe pause the video and think about what do you think are some common misconceptions that folks might have about comics and graphic novels? Let's just take a minute to think about that. Whenever I do this work, and I do this work a lot with groups of teachers, is I ask them, what are some common misconceptions that you hear? And I do this work with students as well. These are the misconceptions that most often come up. So see if they match your list. One of them is that comics and graphic novels don't constitute real reading or real writing for that matter. Another misconception is that they lack the quality of quote unquote literature or even just prose in general. Another one that we talked about just very recently in the slides is that they're too controversial. They're not appropriate for particularly children. And that reading and writing comics and graphic novels is not rigorous enough. It just should not be part of the work we do in literacy spaces because it's too easy. So let's take each one of these common misconceptions and talk back to it a little bit. So let's start with the first one, of course. And as I move through the slides, you'll see images of some comics and graphic novels that I'm also highly recommending. So the slides are kind of doing two things: is offering that content and also recommending some really great comics or specifically graphic novels. So that first misconception that they're not real reading or real writing. Obviously, one of the ways we can push back on this is talk about how graphic novels and comics contain two kinds of text. They contain alphabetic text, so they have words and sentences and paragraphs, and they contain visual text. And readers must decode, comprehend, and synthesize both of these kinds of text. That is a complex thing that you have to do when you're reading a graphic novel or a comic. Another thing is I've done a lot of work with both grade school students, so students in third, fourth grade, fifth, sixth, middle school, high school. I've done this work with undergraduates and graduate students writing graphic novels and comics. So even just writing a 4-panel comic requires decisions that are certainly comparable to writing prose, and in many ways are even more complex than those decisions we have to make when we're writing prose. And so I like to use this sort of visual to show how when we're composing any kind of text, we're juggling a wide variety of decisions that we have to make. So of course we make decisions around content and purpose and craft and process, but we're also making decisions around how we're gonna even have our bodies. So motor planning, we're making decisions around how we want to lay it out. This is particularly the case for compositions that include both alphabetic and visual text. We are making decisions around how we're going to organize it so that our readers can understand it. And so on and so forth. Audience, genre, purpose. There's so many compositional decisions that we make. And when we are including visual text in those compositional decisions, those decisions become that much more complex. Um, so I want you to take a look at this one panel comic, and I want you to tell me, what do we have to know and or do as readers in order to make meaning, in order to read this one panel comic? So again, maybe take a moment to pause and think about what you have to do to read and understand this comic. So we have to make tons of, we have to do lots and lots of work to understand this. And some of you may have read this and not understood it, and that's okay. We have to read both the images and the words. So we see here we have two um, uh, characters from fantasy or science fiction. So we have Batman on the left, we have Darth Vader on the right. If you didn't know those characters, you would not understand this comic. We have to understand the directionality of comics and know that we read from left to right and from top to bottom. We have to have cultural references and knowledge in order to properly read this comic. So if you don't know a lot about Batman or Darth Vader, and if you don't know a lot about Wayne's World, which was a really popular skit in film in the 90s that came from Saturday Night Live, you probably wouldn't understand this comic. So we can decode the words, but that doesn't mean we can read and comprehend this comic. So the comic says, "Party on, Wayne, party on, Darth." And that is sort of a nod to Wayne's World, which is something that they always said at the end of their skit was "Party on, Wayne, party on, Garth," which was the other character, Wayne and Garth. And then they did a riff on their guitars. And so people who know that history and are aware of that pop culture find this comic very funny. People who don't are very perplexed. So there's a lot of complexity in reading even a one panel comic. Let's take a look at what it looks like if we were to remix it. So as writers, because we have to make these important and complex decisions for both the visual and the alphabetic text that will help our readers make appropriate meaning of the work, we can easily slip up. So what if I had this? "Party on, Darth, party on, Batman." Not so funny. Why is that the case? One of the reasons why it doesn't work this way is because Wayne is the first name of Batman. His what is his name? Wayne something. It's losing me right now. And Wayne is also the character name of one of the characters in the SNL skit, Wayne's World. So if we use his name Batman, it doesn't work. Um, oh, Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne, thank you. Um, it also doesn't work if we have Bruce Wayne saying "party on, Darth" first, and then Darth Vader saying his line, because that's not how it worked in the skit. So hopefully this gives you a sense of even the complexity in a one panel comic and all of the decisions we have to make as writers if we're creating something like this, but also the work we have to do as readers to understand it. So let's move on from that common misconception. That's ridiculous. The second misconception is they lack the quality of literature or even prose. Now, I just want to point out, and you can see from some of the examples I have here, graphic novels have been awarded so many prizes and so many accolades in the world. They've been awarded the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, the Newbery Medal, the Caldecott, the Eisner Award, the Bram Stoker Award, the Hugo Prize, and so on and so forth. That if that isn't quality, then I don't really know what is. What are we say about what quality actually means. Um, in addition to these texts being awarded all of these awards, the creators of these texts have been named a MacArthur Fellow. We have a National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. We have Oscar nominees and Oscar winners. We have Emmy nominees and winners, Golden Globe nominees and winners. And just recently, we have a Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters, which was recently awarded to Art Spiegelman, who was the creator of the very popular series Mouse. So to say that these lack the quality of literature, I think is really unfortunate and not true in any sense of the word. In addition, I think we really have to ask what constitutes quality literature? What does that actually mean? We have to really parse that out before we can judge whether a certain form of text is quality or not. Um, and more importantly, who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what's quality and what's not? When we think back to the history of comics in particular, we have people like Mrs. Guy Percy Truelock, who was the comics code authority. She was the person who had the staff who decided that certain comics met this code and certain comics did not. But she's just one of many white elite people who made those decisions on behalf of all readers. And we have people like the comics, so-called comics czar, Charles F. Murphy, who was a part of that comics code authority. Who's to say that these people have the authority to determine what is quality or appropriate or not? And these days, of course, we have people like Moms for Liberty and other groups deciding that what's not right for their particular child is not right for all children. I mean, who gets to decide that? I think that's a question worth asking over and over again and looking at the patterns of who determines what books and particularly what comics and graphic novels should be banned or challenged. Because there's certainly a pattern there if we look at it. Um, Third misconception: these texts are too controversial. Hmm. Now, we talked about Dr. Frederick Wertham and some of the controversial things that he pointed out in comics back in the Golden Age, some of which were certainly true. The way that female bodies or bodies that had breasts and hips were portrayed. Those were certainly questionable, and those continue to be questionable, and especially in the superhero genre of comics. Um, he also brought up the racism in many portrayals of characters in comics and the over exaggeration of features, which was definitely true. But let's think about what's being brought up today in terms of controversy. So again, here are some really wonderful graphic novels that have been flagged and challenged in many spaces for being too controversial. But I want us to unpack what is meant by controversial. So just like we need to question what does quality literature mean and who gets to decide, what is meant by controversial? And more importantly, whose lives and experiences are centered in this notion of controversial? Because it's no surprise to any of us here, most likely, that many of the graphic novels that get flagged and banned and challenged are graphic novels that feature characters that have an identity that falls under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella. Um, and when those identities are flagged as controversial, that is centering very obviously a cis heteronormative identity. Um, and that is, in essence, telling people who identify under that umbrella of LGBTQIA plus that their very existence is controversial. And that is more dehumanizing than almost anything I could come up with right now. Um, and remember, this reflects a long history of talking about what's controversial or quote unquote appropriate. Um, some of the most common reasons for book challenges today, if you look at those reasons, are that these books feature LGBT, I don't know why I'm suffering with this acronym today, LGBTQIA plus people or characters, that they contain quote unquote sexually explicit images, that they contain profanity, that they go against family values and morals. Many have been flagged or challenged because they go into the history of slavery or racism. And some have even been challenged because they contain a quote unquote political viewpoint. But if we look at, for example, Mouse has been challenged quite a bit in the past several years. And one of the biggest reasons why it was challenged in many spaces was because of these sexually explicit images. This is a picture of one of those quote unquote sexually explicit images. And so I just wanted to sort of take a long look at that and question if that is horrific enough to people to think that the entire catalog of these Mouse books should be banned from a space in schools and classrooms. Again, let's remember that the author and illustrator of these books was just recently named to be was offered one of the most distinguished medals in literature history. And I also want us to remember that, or to know, if you don't know the history, that comics have always been political. They've always been partisan. Back in the golden age, again, many readers were highly encouraged who read Captain America to become a sentinel of liberty and to get this card that they could put in their wallet that pledges these principles: in God we trust, allegiance to the flag and the Constitution of the United States of America, and to make themselves better citizens and defend their government forever. So there has always been a political viewpoint in comics. Remember when they first came into newspaper spaces in the United States, they were political commentary. They were commentary and satire that really made a statement about what was happening in society at the time. So, I think a lot of these reasons, most common reasons that are really uh, particular for graphic novels, I think we need to break those down and really talk about what they mean and question them. Okay, last one: reading and writing comics and graphic novels is not rigorous enough. So I already talked about all of the decisions we have to make when we both read and write comics and graphic novels. But again, we need to ask, not rigorous or intellectually demanding enough for whom? Who are we centering when we talk about this idea that they're not rigorous enough? And what is meant by intellectually demanding? What assumptions are embedded in this? What definitions of reading and writing are we working with when we say that these aren't rigorous enough? I think that those are important questions to really consider and talk about. There are research findings as well, especially around vocabulary. For example, the University of Oregon found that comic books average 53.5 rare words per thousand, while children's books average 30.9, adult books average 52.7, expert witness testimony averages 28.4, and the conversations of college graduates with friends average 17.3 rare words per thousand. Another study found that the average comic book introduces kids to twice as many words as the average children's book. I think they're referring to picture books here, and 5 times as many words as they were likely to be exposed to in the average child adult conversation. But again, when we're talking about vocabulary, we also need to talk about whose vocabulary is being centered or privileged in this case. That is something else that really needs to be interrogated. And I talk about that a lot in my most recent book, Literacy for All. Um, and Sean P. Connors, who's a scholar of comics and graphic novels, he wrote this great piece, The Best of Both Worlds, Rethinking the Literary Merit of Graphic Novels. And he writes that rather than condemn comic books as a pernicious influence, why not choose to appropriate them as a tool with which to foster student interest in quote unquote traditional literature? Asked to provide a rationale for teaching traditional literature, educators routinely cite its ability to foster self reflection, initiate social change, promote tolerance, and stimulate the imagination. As those who read them know, good graphic novels are capable of realizing these same ends. And there's been lots of research that talks about that and how they do promote a sense of empathy for many different identities and lived experiences as well. In addition, there's lots of scaffolding benefits of comics and graphic novels, in particular for students who may have reading disabilities, for students whose first language may not be English. There's lots of research that shows how they are useful aids in assisting with reading comprehension, that they reduce the cognitive load of dense text, that they expose students to literature like that we would think of in the dominant sphere, like so-called classics, like Shakespeare and just so many others that I can't think of off the top of my head that have been remixed into graphic novel form. And so a lot of these kind of benefits of having that visual text alongside the alphabetic text really help with exposure to lots of different kinds of literature. But most importantly, what do the students have to say about these common misconceptions? I had the opportunity to ask several students, and here's what some of them said. So, a fourth grader said that graphic novels are how I started reading. As someone who has a hard time reading, the pictures help me understand more. Chapter books aren't a good fit for me. M says, if it's about something that's true, the pictures make it easier to help you understand. Graphic novels can have lots of words, Jay says. That's reading. A fifth grader says, sometimes I have to sound out words in graphic novels. I do more reading in graphic novels because I read the pictures too. C says, comics and graphic novels belong in school. If adults put them away, kids might not read. If picture books are real reading, then graphic novels are too. And A says, some graphic novels are funny and can make someone feel better and read more. And if adults don't like them because they haven't read them, they should try it. So I have this advocacy guide that I started, and I've done this work with graduate students where we've created our own. And I would really encourage folks to look at some of that or go back to the slides and pick up some of that research. Or look at the handout that I provided for folks and skim some of that research and add to this so that we all have common language and advocacy type language that we can use to push back on so many of these common misconceptions. And we can leave this open. This is a dynamic document that we can continue to add to and refine as we continue to learn more and more. So I really encourage folks to use this document and to add to it. And if there are other misconceptions that you can think of that you hear in your professional life, definitely add to this. This is open to anybody who wants to add to it. So thank you so much. I hope that gave you some language and more in-depth understanding of how we came to where we are today in terms of comics and graphic novels. And if you liked what you learned here, definitely check out some of my other work. And most importantly, if you learned something today, please consider donating to one of our adopted charities for today's Ed Collab gathering. Thank you so much for joining me and take care.